Good morning. So today we have a nice frosty November morning. We're going to be heading out to Quabbin Reservoir, and Quabbin Reservoir is located in north central Massachusetts. It's a very, very interesting place because there are so many stories to talk about Quabbin. We're going to go out there, and it's known as the accidental wilderness because it was originally 4 villages that are now all flooded and underwater at the reservoir, which has created this extensive wilderness around it, which has brought in all kinds of wildlife that would not have been there normally. There's moose, there's coyotes, there's black bears, there's even physical evidence of mountain lions having been out there. In addition to this accidental wilderness and wildlife that we see out there, there's a lot of human history in terms of the towns and communities that were there only 70 years ago. And then there's also the issues of how natural resources are utilized. This is a water source for Boston, which is eastern Massachusetts, has the majority of the population of Massachusetts. 70% of the population of Massachusetts gets their water from this reservoir. So there's a lot to see out there and a lot to talk about. So are you excited, Phil?
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
All right.
It's been a while since I've been out there.
All right, good. Well, it's going to be fun. We can already hear the turkeys gobbling, so we're excited to get outside and do some hiking and see what we can see.
So they were living in the tree. Yeah. And they rotted, the tree rotted, was in the center, was all rotted.
Oh, that's interesting. So you never made that connection
Until all of a sudden they said, hey, you know, there doesn't any black carpenter ants anymore.
That's funny. All right, so we've been walking now on the old Main Street here for maybe quarter to half of a mile. And what we're seeing now as we get closer to the center of town is we're starting to see some of the cellar holes. So what we have right here is this is the foundation of what was one of the barns in Dena. And so when they created the reservoir, they dammed the Swift River and the Ware River, and they knew that, of course, the rivers were going to flood, and so these communities had to be abandoned. And so all of the houses were purchased by eminent domain by the state of Massachusetts. And the houses were either disassembled and moved, or disassembled and just the materials were taken away, or some of them were even burned down. I don't know the exact story of this particular barn, but this was the foundation of what was a barn up until probably about 1936 or 1938. And so there are some implements here. We can see some old cables and some sheet metal that may have been part of a tractor or some sort of machinery. And then what I always think is really interesting when we look at these is this really wasn't very long ago, but we can see there's actually a few sugar maples that are growing up in what was the interior of the barn. And so the age of these sugar maples is indicative of how long this barn has been gone. And so it's been approximately 70 years. You can kind of look right there. Those trees are probably about 70 years old. But it's interesting to kind of visualize. The barn was built on top of this. This was probably the interior where there may have been a stable or just equipment was stored. I'm sure there's probably a floor up on top of this, and then there was probably a hayloft. So the remnants of the barn. So one of the things I always think is very interesting looking at these cellar holes and foundations is you can see where the trees grow up. It gives you an indication of how long the structure has been abandoned. And in this case right here, we can see over on the perimeter of the barn, we have several sugar maples that have been growing since the barn has been removed. Again, it was approximately 70 years ago. So we can see that larger tree is probably about 70 years old. And these other ones are coming up a little bit younger, but the forest is reclaiming what once was settled. So here we are, we have the barn, we have the foundation of the barn, and then right across the street, we can see here's the front stoop of the house where the people lived, and their barn right across the street. And to me, it's just interesting to see as we're witnessing the forest taking over a community. And so in time, everything's going to kind of grow through the paved road. We can see where the home was, and everything, all the brushes and brambles have gone kind of wild. This was the front stoop. And then when you're looking for these cellar holes, one of the things you want to, kind of like a telltale sign when you find one, is this maple tree right here. It was very traditional that when a couple moved into a home, would be to plant 1 or 2 sugar maples in front of the house. And so this tree right here is very, very likely that tree that this couple, say 80 years ago, may have planted when they first moved into this house. And so all that's left, because the house has been removed for the reservoir, is we just have some slabs of granite. We have this front stoop and a little bit of a foundation where the home was. Kind of behind here, some of these brambles, is we have some wild rose and some bittersweet that's kind of coming up. Sometimes you find old grapevines and things that were near the house when the people lived here. So again, we're right near the house, and over here we can see a grapevine that has gone feral. So that was a grapevine that was growing near the home. It was probably convenient for them to come out and pick grapes from the house. And of course, since the house has been abandoned, everything's kind of gone wild. And so we have this feral grapevine that's kind of growing up into the trees. Very common thing to see around a lot of these foundations here and elsewhere in Massachusetts. So again, we can kind of see how nature is sort of reclaiming the entire area. Not only the wild plants, but also plants that have gone feral, that were planted and were a part of the community and now are living and thriving on their own. All right, as we get progressively closer to the center of Dena, we're starting to see more and more of these cellar holes and these foundations. And one of the things that you always have to keep in mind as you're looking at these is that these homes were built at different times. And so what we see here is this was probably built, this is a house that was probably built, I would imagine, in the 1700s. You can kind of see this is a very small foundation. And this is literally just stones, just kind of piled up stones. And so even though the foundation is this small, the house was bigger. And we have to remember is you can just kind of look here and just imagine how much work it was to build a home without modern machinery and without modern equipment, without concrete back in the day. So whoever built this house, probably homesteaded it, had to dig down into the soil, probably hand digging this hole out, had to carry all these stones, gather them from the forest, bring them out here to kind of build up their foundation. So it was a tremendous amount of work to build a foundation. So that's why these are so small. The house, the actual house, was probably 3, maybe 4 times larger than this footprint up on top of here, and was likely a story or 2 high. But this foundation right here is all that still remains. So this was one of the older homes of Dena. As we get closer and closer to town, we start to see things that are a little bit more modern looking in terms of materials and in terms of size. All right, so we're getting a little closer to the center of Dena, and as we get closer to the center of town, the foundations and the cellar holes that we're seeing are increasingly modern. And so in contrast to that barn foundation that we saw further down, that was so small, is this one here. We have the 3 walls, and this was a pretty big structure. And so what we can kind of imagine here is we have the 3 walls. This side of the barn was open. There are probably barn doors that opened up. Kind of coming into here is probably where they may have kept animals, possibly. Probably more likely there was equipment stored in here. And then of course the barn was built overhead. And again, I imagine, just from what I know of the barns and the farms around here, is there was probably a big first floor, and then above that, probably the hayloft. This is one of my very favorite photographs of Dena. So we're in the center of Dena, and this is actually the old school that used to be right here in the center of town. And in this photograph, we can see the school, we can see this tree that's over on the side of it, we can see where the cemetery was also on the other side directly behind me, and we can compare it to reality. So directly behind me we have the cellar hole, the foundation where the school was. The tree is still there. We can see the posts from the fence line that ran along the school. There are people today that are still alive that went to this school. So now it's kind of like a ghost town as the wilderness is returning, and this entire community center has been abandoned for the sake of the reservoir. One of the most eerie things is that as not only did they remove the buildings, but the cemetery, which was right next to the school, is they actually dug up all the graves. They removed everybody, and everyone's been reburied, but everything here has been removed. And there's some resentment from some of the people that were forced to give up their homes and to move out of town. But you know, the end result of the story is that we have this wilderness returning, and we have fresh water for the greater Boston area. Oh, look what I found here. This is very interesting. So what we have behind me is, used to be Potapog Pond, but it's now been flooded by Quabbin Reservoir, which is out there. This is the closest the level of the water got to Dena. And so what I just found floating in the water right here, it's probably 6.5 feet long, is we have a beaver stick. And so this is a stick, it looks like it may have been a striped maple, but that's just a guess. But I can see here is that the beavers have eaten the bark off of this stick, just like eating corn on a cob. So a beaver cut this down. You can see where he cut it down at this end, and then the beaver had it out in the water and just ate the bark off. You can see some of the teeth marks on the bark right there. And he just stripped this down, and it was floating in the water. So we have a lot of beaver in this area. There's actually a beaver lodge kind of around the bend over there. And what we're seeing where I'm standing right here as well is a lot of slides where the beavers are going up into the woods and then sliding down into the water. We can also see some otter sign. We have some otter scat right here as well. So the beavers and the otters are taking advantage of the fact that the water's here, and it provides them with habitat that they wouldn't have had if the town of Dena was still up above. So again, the animals follow the wilderness as the wilderness returns. Here we are, here's Quabbin Reservoir, and what we're looking over right now is where the former town of Enfield used to be. So all where there's water right now at one time was the town of Enfield. And in fact, the center of Enfield right now behind me is 90 feet below the water. And so this Quabbin Reservoir is the largest body of fresh water in the state of Massachusetts. It's one of the largest reservoirs in the entire United States. From north to south, it's 18 miles as the crow flies from north to south. And if we were to walk the entire shoreline, there's 181 miles of shoreline. The reservoir holds 412 billion gallons of water. So this reservoir serves 70% of the population of Massachusetts. So again, what we're overlooking here, this was the Swift River Valley, the Swift River and the Ware River were dammed up to create this reservoir. And so all the forest we see around it is that accidental wilderness that we were talking about. So this provides fresh water for the state of Massachusetts and habitat for all sorts of Massachusetts wildlife.